Hello, everybody. So we have finally reached the point in the novel where our hero arrives in Harlem. And so I'm going to take the opportunity today to tell you a little bit about the history of Harlem up to the point at which our story arrives. Okay, so this is where Harlem is located in New York. And seeing here how it's positioned at the very northern end of Manhattan Island, which ends here at the Harlem River on the north side. It kind of looks like this neighborhood is just simply the result of the kind of urban sprawl that is the feature of so many megacities these days. But in fact, Harlem began as a village that was connected to the Dutch fortress of New Amsterdam all the way back in the early 1600s. This right here is a map of New Amsterdam as it existed when the Dutch occupied it. Um, Manhattan Island is kind of lying on its side in this image, so Harlem would be off to the right in what looks like just empty space. Harlem was a farming community outside of the New Amsterdam fortifications, outside of this wall here that you see. By the way, the reason why Wall Street is called Wall Street is because it's where the wall was when this was originally a Dutch fortress. So because it was outside of the fortifications, Harlem was the target of pretty regular raids by local Native American tribes and was at one point completely abandoned by the settlers. However, once the British purchased New Amsterdam from the Dutch in 1664, New Amsterdam was renamed New York City. After the Duke of York later would become King James II and the Seventh. But Harlem remained Harlem. It retained its Dutch name and a lot of its original Dutch inhabitants. During the British period, Harlem was the site of many country estates owned by wealthy people who lived in New York who wanted to escape the disease and general squalor of downtown. During the early part of the Revolutionary War, Harlem served as an outpost for George Washington, and the Battle of Harlem Heights was actually Washington's first major success in the war. However, he was later forced to abandon it and withdraw north, allowing the British to take control of Manhattan Island for the rest of the war. During the early national period, so after the Revolution, Harlem would resume its place as a retreat for New York's wealthy and influential citizens, including first Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. This is his house right here. You can actually go and visit it today. The gradual urbanization of Harlem began with the early 19th century city planning efforts, which laid out this grid pattern that we recognize today, where you have these avenues that run north south and then the streets that run east and west, forming these perfect right angles once you get outside kind of the somewhat less orderly part of lower Manhattan, what's now the financial district. The next major step came in 1837 when the New York and Harlem Railroad connected one end of the island to the other. And by doing so, made it possible for people to commute from uptown to downtown daily for work. In New York, when you talk about uptown, you're talking about stuff that's at the northern end of Manhattan Island, and downtown is the stuff that's south. So this made Harlem, the extension of this rail line made Harlem an attractive place for professional shopkeepers and workers, but also it made it attractive for real estate speculators who over time transformed this area's bucolic natural setting into a landscape of tenements and row houses. The modern boundaries of Harlem are merged with the completion of Central Park in 1876. So if we return to this map, you can see how the southern border of the Harlem neighborhood is right up against Central Park. So once you get north of the park, you are essentially in Harlem, although East Harlem kind of overlaps a little bit with the first main block of the park. Um, the sort of next step was the consolidation of New York City, where New York City kind of annexed a lot of the area nearby it, um, such that New York City now consists of Manhattan Island plus Brooklyn, plus what was Western Queens County and the Bronx west of the Bronx River and Staten Island. So when it talks about the five boroughs of New York, that's what it means. Those all used to be sort of separate towns or separate counties, and New York sort of annexed all of them and made it one big city. So this also meant that Harlem was absorbed. It was no longer a separate village, but was formally part of the city. During the early 20th century, the New York subway system was also built. The first line was opened in 1904, and this offered even quicker transit from throughout Manhattan and further connected uptown and downtown, so made it much easier to get around than in the past. The vision behind New York's grid pattern, as you see here, was actually to create a city that, unlike major European cities, had no definitive center. So, whereas Moscow, everything kind of revolves around the Kremlin, and the city kind of, that's the area that is central. The idea was to create a city here in which there's no center, in which, at least topographically, no part would be more important than any other. And this was kind of supposed to reflect the democratic ideals of that early national period. But of course, as you've seen, this did not do away with social inequality, as we've seen both in Sister Carrie and Gangs of New York. Like the rest of New York, Harlem would be a home both to the rich and the powerful. In fact, it was home to Boss Tweed and some other high ranking Tammany Hall figures, as well as to the poor immigrants who arrived in the city in droves. So by the end of the 20th of the excuse me, by the end of the 19th century, Harlem was home to significant populations of Irish immigrants, as well as Italians, Germans, and East European Jews. African Americans had lived in Harlem from the very beginning, when it was just a Dutch village. Many arrived as slaves during the colonial period, though later generations of Black New Yorkers would have been born free. So, though slavery was officially abolished in the state in 1827, racial segregation was the rule in New York City, meaning that there were some places where Black people were not allowed to live. And African Americans were therefore confined to some of the very poorest areas and were subjected with some regularity to violence. As you saw in Gangs of New York, the draft riots of 1863, while it did represent an outpouring of anger at the US government and the military, it also played out as a kind of anti Black pogrom with violence directed at Black residents and at institutions. One might think that some persecuted immigrant groups could have found common cause with New York's Black population. And in Scorsese's film, we do see some small degree of desegregation in the 5 Points, and his gang has kind of one token Black member. But the truth is that Irish Americans in general could be just as racist as the Anglo American majority. In fact, in Tyler Anbinder's book on the 5 Points, he says that an Irish American publication called the Daybook opposed the use of African Americans in the Union armies because, quote, equality as soldiers means equality at the ballot box, equality everywhere, which would result in the Irish being degraded to a level with Negroes. When in late June, an Irish American mob in Newburgh, New York, lynched an African American accused of assaulting an Irish woman, the Irish American blamed Republicans whose emancipation policy had, quote, sedulously placed the Negro with all his drawbacks of character and condition in opposition to the white man. Republicans complained the Irish American had thrust the Negro again in their whites' faces, even though whites were already smarting under the reverses brought about by the war. So, in other words, Irish people opposed any sort of civil rights progress for African Americans because they would, it would then elevate them to the same level, which would mean that, the point is that in a very stratified society, you want to be better than somebody, you want to be higher than somebody. So, raising the condition of African Americans would somehow humiliate the Irish people. And therefore, they tended to oppose this kind of civil rights progress or move towards social equality. So, seeking protection from all of this, the Black population of the city tended to cluster in certain neighborhoods. And over time, the center of Black New York shifted northwards, sometimes in response to real estate trends and sometimes in response to violence. So, by the Civil War, the majority of the Black residents had actually left the 5 Points and had begun settling in Greenwich Village, which is a neighborhood we're going to see next week in If Beale Street Could Talk. And also in the Tenderloin district here, kind of on the left side, where you see the yellow arrow pointing. Also in the San Juan Hill area, which is this spot just south of Central Park, where the top yellow arrow is pointing. This is actually, San Juan Hill is now Lincoln Center. The established African American families were joined by newcomers from the Great Migration, which I talked about last week, as well as new immigrants from the West Indies, so Jamaica, Haiti, etc. In 1900, a black man in the Tenderloin district stabbed and killed a plainclothes police officer who had propositioned his girlfriend. And this set off a wave of attacks by white, mostly Irish, policemen against the black community and resulted in 70 assaults. This prompted many of the residents to again begin moving up the island. San Juan Hill was also the site of a race riot in 1905. And in the 1940s, that neighborhood ultimately met the same fate as the Five Points and was simply wiped off the map as a part of slum clearance and urban renewal. Gradually, Harlem became the destination for middle class and wealthy Black residents who were seeking to escape this social unrest and to gain access to newer buildings with better amenities. As racial policies that prohibited them from renting such places downtown either were not being enforced or they were the contracts that kept them from renting those places or buying those places were beginning to expire. Even in Harlem, however, African Americans were charged significantly higher rent than white residents, a practice that simultaneously exploited the Black population by forcing them to pay more for worse apartments. But it also made Black renters somewhat more attractive to Harlem landlords who were accustomed to renting to immigrants. In 1904, an entrepreneur named Philip Payton, who was eventually known as the father of colored Harlem, established the Afro American Realty Company, which not only owned many buildings to rent to fellow African Americans, but offered management services to white landlords who were willing to rent properties to Black residents. His financial success, however, was precisely attributable to these higher rents that landlords were able to charge African Americans. And so he was accused by his contemporaries of trying to capitalize on racism and essentially exploiting his own people. However, at least according to the historian Jim Garrison, it was due to the efforts of real estate brokers like Payton that by 1915, 50,000 of Manhattan's 60,000 Negroes called more than 1,000 buildings in central Harlem home. This trend did not go unnoticed or unopposed by the white Harlemites. White real estate developers and property owners fought back by building houses that would have been out of the price range of most African Americans, and also by using racial covenants, which made the sale of property conditional on the buyer's agreement not to sell or rent to Black people. White activists also formed organizations with the purpose of keeping out Black residents. Said a real estate journal called the New York Indicator, their, meaning African Americans' presence is undesirable among us. They should not only be disenfranchised, but also segregated in some colony in the outskirts of the city, where their transportation and other problems will not inflict injustice and disgust on worthy citizens. So, this was the attitude of a lot of white professionals in Harlem at the time. Ultimately, however, the financial incentives were just too strong. And the conversion of Harlem into a middle class Black enclave with a lot of Black owned real estate and Black owned businesses was, according to Garrison, something that no one man could achieve or prevent. By the 1930s, the word Harlem would become synonymous with Black New York and even Black America. These social and economic forces combine to produce the explosion of creative and intellectual activity that has become known as the Harlem Renaissance. This was the movement that gave birth to jazz and all of its immortal artists. You have Louis Armstrong, Count Basie, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, Duke Ellington, and Josephine Baker, just to name but a few. It also brought to prominence a new generation of African American writers, including the poet Langston Hughes, the poet Countee Cullen, the novelists Nella Larson and Zora Neale Hurston, as well as W.E.B. Du Bois, who I mentioned last week, and then, of course, Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison. These writers are generally on required reading lists in American schools and universities. Quite a sample of canonical writers of the 20th century come precisely from this neighborhood and from this period. The Harlem Renaissance was also associated with a new political consciousness for African Americans. The publication of Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk in 1903 marked the beginning of a general move away from the accommodationist and assimilationist strategies of Booker T. Washington, and toward acts of self-assertion and civil disobedience that would characterize the mid-century civil rights movement. So in the formulation that Igor gave us on Monday, we begin to see kind of the leaving behind of the integrationist strategy, or the strategy of trying to kind of fit in a white supremacist society, and more a strategy of resistance. In this seminal work, Du Bois argues that African Americans experience what he calls a double consciousness, and this became this very influential idea. He said that double consciousness is this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, and this forces a Black person to at all times hold in his mind both his own sense of himself, his own self respect, but also to keep in mind the way that the white world looks at him, which, of course, these ideas are deeply in contradiction. So he says that the Black man, one feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The path to reconciling these two warring ideals, he argued, was not the path of assimilation pursued by Washington, but neither was it any effort to quote unquote Africanize America. This is the path that would be pursued to some extent by Black nationalists and Pan Africanists. His goal, he said, was simply to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without losing the opportunity for self development. Du Bois's work inspired the creation of the NAACP, which stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, an organization dedicated to the pursuit of civil rights for Black people. It also inspired the creation of the Urban League, which was a more explicitly New York-centric organization that sought to provide resources to the Black community locally. The influence of Du Bois's ideal of double consciousness is very evident in Invisible Man, and a lot of the literary criticism on this novel looks at it through the lens of this idea of double consciousness. So it's something that I want us to talk about in our online discussion. You could argue, perhaps, that it is at the core of the metaphors of visibility and invisibility that run throughout the entire novel. If you've been tracking all of the references to sight, or blindness, or visibility, invisibility, etc. in this novel, good for you. It's something you should be paying attention to. However, we are also going to see in this novel the influence of two other political movements that were prominent in Harlem during this period. One is socialism, and the other is Black nationalism or Pan-Africanism. That is actually going to be the subject of a whole other lecture once we get further in the novel, and these issues, socialism and Black nationalism, become more relevant to our discussion. So for now, I'm just going to leave us here and leave you to contemplate this idea of two-ness and how it applies to the characters that we have met so far in this book.